The Legend of Zelda, Ocarina of Time, is widely considered one of the greatest games ever made. It pushed storytelling in the Legend of Zelda series to a whole new level, as well as taking the gameplay into the world of 3D. This leap was not just revolutionary for the Zelda series, but it transformed the action-adventure genre forever. Even if this game is not your favorite and you think it's overrated, it can't be overstated how important this game was and still is in the history of gaming. Welcome to another entry in the Reviews Done Right series. If this is your first time watching one of my reviews, I recommend you watch the first one in this series. A link is provided in the video description below. But if you don't want to, I'll just give you a quick rundown on how I review games. First of all, I do a true 100 point scale, meaning 50 is average, 0 is the worst game ever, and 100 is pure gaming perfection. Second, my scale revolves around the idea that gameplay is king. Gameplay is what makes games and not movies. Story and visuals are great and all, but they're secondary to gameplay. That's just the way it is. Finally, I am aware that reviews are subjective. It's impossible to treat them as 100% factual. And that is my disclaimer, telling you up front, I'm biased. But I'm going to try to be as objective as possible, while at the same time acknowledging that the way I'm going to grade the game has everything to do with my views. Anyway, here are the categories for my reviews. Gameplay, 40 points. Story, 20 points. Visuals and audio, 15 points each. And a section I like to call intangibles, which we will get to later, a total of 10 points. Let's get started. Gameplay. Ocarina of Time was the first 3D Zelda game. This may not mean much to us now, but think about what a transition this was at the time. We had gone from 3 isometric view games and one side-scrolly thingy to full 3D. Even if the transition was just going to be one for turning 2D dungeons into 3D ones, this would have been quite the feat. But I don't think it can quite be overstated how big of a jump this was, not just for us gamers, but for the developers. What Ocarina of Time did to the 3D adventure genre is nothing short of revolutionary. The first thing I'm going to say is that you have to judge a game by its time period. In other words, these sorts of games can't be judged by today's standards because it doesn't make any sense. And here's what I mean. I've seen videos on YouTube talking about how bad the controls are in Ocarina of Time because it didn't have dual analog controls. Well, but guess what else didn't have dual analog controls? Almost every game that came out back then. Because let me remind you that the original PlayStation controller didn't even have analog sticks. I mean, even some PlayStation 2 games didn't utilize dual analog control. So let's just get that out of the way. The N64 controller may not have been the best controller ever made, and in fact it's probably one of my least favorite controllers, but let's not pretend it wasn't technologically appropriate for its time. So not having full dual analog control for Link today seems weird and wrong, but back then it didn't feel wrong at all. Even the developers, however, knew that there was something missing. So they invented something that you and I take for granted to this very day, and that's lock-on targeting. That's right, The Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time was the first game to ever have a lock-on targeting system that allowed the player character to move around in 3D space. And think about every game that uses that today. The first series that comes to mind right now is the Dark Souls games. Metroid Prime does it as well. A lot of GTA-style games take advantage of this. Bayonetta, God of War, and games of that genre as well. And obviously, every other Zelda 3D game since. And that's just scratching the surface of the games that use this mechanic today. Another mechanic that might not be as useful today with dual analog controls that allow character movement with one stick and camera with the other. Another thing that Ocarina of Time did was create a method to be able to center the camera behind the character. At any time, you can press Z button and center the camera behind you. And again, that's something that's used today, though maybe not quite as often. Finally, let's talk about the context-sensitive Use button. The A button was used for all kinds of things. If you were running, pressing it made you roll. If you had your weapon out, standing still allowed you to put it away. If you were next to a ledge, pressing it made you climb. Next to a block, you could grab. Next to an NPC, you could talk. all with the A button. And again, that's something you probably take for granted today, and it was started with this game. Every aspect of the gameplay was centered around these innovations. And make no mistake, they're literally game changers. At its heart, Ocarina of Time is an action-adventure game, with combat being one of the central pillars of the gameplay experience. All three of these control innovations come into play during combat. Obviously, Z-targeting being the main one, being able to focus your attention on an enemy even as you and your enemy traverse the 3D space. Context-sensitive A button allowed you to backflip or jump sideways depending on which way you were tilting the analog stick, which made combat not just more intuitive, but a little more strategic. For example, you knew you could get in close, get off a few attacks, and backflip away. It changed the game from being a simple hack and slash to something that you actually had to think about. And look, I'm not saying Ocarina of Time is some grand master strategy fighting game. It's not. In my most recent playthrough, I do often just hack and slash some opponents, and it works just fine, but you can't get away with that all the time. You do that against an iron knuckle, and you're gonna lose. But the combat works. For the most part, Z-targeting an enemy and either just using the targeting system to strafe around the enemy, waiting for an opening, or blocking one of their attacks and countering, it works. In fact, many of the enemies expect you to be patient. Take the Wolfos, for example. It'll block 99% of your attacks if you just start swinging at them wildly. You're supposed to wait for them to attack, which leaves them open for a counterattack. It's a mechanic purposefully implemented into the combat. Admittedly, it doesn't get much deeper than that. Most enemies that you can't just hack will have a similar strategy. Be patient, wait for them to attack, then counter. But you have other types of enemies as well. Some throw projectiles, some fly into you, some are stationary, more like obstacles that damage you, rather than enemies actively seeking to do you harm. And that brings us to enemy variety. Let's talk about that. There are quite a lot of different enemy types, each of them bringing a new challenge to the table. So again, you have your stationary enemies like your Deku Babas or your Skulltulas, which don't really come at you, but rather wait until you approach them. Then you have enemies like Tektites and the Fire Slugs, which aren't aggressive until you get too close to them. Then you have your subset of what I like to call dueling enemies. These range from the humble Wolfos to the mighty Iron Knuckle. These fights are little events unto themselves. Typically a fight with these enemies is in a locked room or area, and you have to defeat them to exit. Sometimes these fights involve mini-boss music, letting you know that they're a little bit more difficult than the rest. And these tend to be my favorite types of fight. They require just a little more skill, just a little more patience than the other enemies tend to, and it just makes it that much more satisfying when you win. As far as the difficulty, it's not really a difficult game, and I mean that both from a combat perspective and the puzzles. The Legend of Zelda series is known for its puzzles, but I think that for the most part, puzzles in this series have never really been that difficult. I would say that Breath of the Wild has some head scratchers in some of the shrines, but the puzzles in the series have been made the stuff of legends while not really being that difficult. They do make you think about your surroundings and the items that you've acquired, sure, but typically all you need to do is use the item you just got in the dungeon. It's been a staple in the Zelda series since forever. How you use that item in a particular situation is really the crux of the puzzles in this series. The combat isn't that difficult either. As I mentioned before, there are a few different enemy types. The obstacle enemies are only dangerous if you're a goof and actually run into them. The dueling enemies are typically very polite and will wait for you to defeat their comrade before jumping into the fight themselves. There are a few exceptions to this, but they're rare. The boss fights are not overly difficult either, but I think they're really well done. Each of them feels epic in their own way. But from a gameplay perspective, each of them requires just a little bit of strategy. As we have come to expect in the Zelda games, you typically use the item you found in the dungeon against that dungeon's boss. This is true to certain degrees in every boss fight in this game. In the Deku Tree, you get the slingshot. You use the slingshot against Queen Goma. In the Spirit Temple, you get the Mirror Shield. You use the Mirror Shield against Kume and Kotake. Overall, I would say my favorite boss is definitely Phantom Ganon. Not just because it's a good fight, not just because it's a creepy boss in a creepy dungeon, but because it's a bit of a foreshadowing in that you'll have to fight Ganondorf like this at the end of the game. And speaking of Ganondorf, let's talk about this boss fight. The fight with Ganondorf is probably the most difficult in the game, especially the first time you do it, since 1, you don't have Navi's Z-targeting to assist you, and 2, you can fall down the pit whenever he makes the blocks fall. And that's not even mentioning his second phase where he does Spirit Bomb at you, and if you think you can reflect that back at him, whew, you're in for a bad surprise. It's what comes next that's either the easiest or most difficult battle in the game. If you know that you can roll between Ganon's legs to avoid his attacks and get a free shot or 2 on his tail, you're quite literally in for the easiest boss fight in the entire game. In my latest run, I took 0 damage from him. It's roll under, swing your sword, back off. Repeat. If you don't know about this, then this battle becomes significantly more challenging. In order to get around to his tail, you must stun Ganon. In order to stun him, you can use Deku Nuts, your hookshot, or arrows, with the nuts giving you the least amount of stun time and the arrows giving you the most. The problem comes as the battle goes on, you keep doing damage to him, Ganon starts blocking your projectiles to his face. He knows you're going to try to stun him with either the hookshot or an arrow, and he begins to block your attempts with his swords. This can become frustrating, especially if you're running out of arrows, which means that you then have to use your hookshot, which gives less of a stun time, and all in all, it can just become a really tough battle, especially because Ganon hits very hard. I like that this final fight is the most difficult of the fights. It's obviously fitting, especially in this context as Ganondorf is the king of evil, but I also like that if you know of the easy way, this boss is a cakewalk. It rewards you, in a way, for being clever enough to attempt to roll between his legs. Anyways, I really enjoy the Ganon fight in particular. The sky is dark, and you can only see his glowing eyes upon his giant lumbering form. The music is tense, the stakes are of course at their highest. It's a great ending to a game with some pretty good boss fights. Alright, so the combat is a major part of this game. But there's more to it than just that. I want to talk about the level design. Now think back and recall that A Link to the Past kinda toyed around with the idea of having themed dungeons. We had the Desert Palace, for example, which had sand inside, and we had the Ice Palace, which was appropriately ice themed, and maybe throw in the Swamp Palace in there too, with a sort of water temple vibe, having to raise and lower the water levels to progress. But it was light. Dungeon themes were fully embraced and explored in Ocarina of Time, but the game didn't fall into the trap of letting the theme of the dungeon dictate the design, with one exception. Here's what I mean. Going into Death Mountain, for example, as an adult, and heading inside the Fire Temple, you expected to be going into the depths of a volcano, because that's exactly what Death Mountain is. Inside you'll find pools of flowing magma, enemies that are covered in flame, and traps that have to do with fire and circumventing it. But change the theme to anything else, and you still get a really good dungeon. If it weren't pools of magma but, say, quicksand, the dungeon still works. If the fire slugs were instead regular slugs or plague slugs which poison you, not much would change. You could still wander around rescuing captured Gorons or whatever other prisoner. The Megaton Hammer could still be a workable game mechanic. In other words, the dungeon still works, even without the fire theme. I think that's what made these dungeons great. They're great dungeons on their own, and then they have a layer of theme applied to them which make them feel story appropriate. I would say the glaring exception to this is the Water Temple, which no matter how many times I play, I absolutely hate. And I think I hate it not because it's a bad dungeon, and I do think it's a bad dungeon, but because of the other dungeons. They're so good that this one just stands out so much. I think you can really feel the difference playing this dungeon. They wanted to do a dungeon where you raise and lower the water level. This dungeon could have only worked with a water themed level because no other substance really works with this overarching mechanic in mind. You could do it with sand, I guess, but it just really wouldn't make much sense. And what ended up happening is that instead of making a puzzle or two based on this mechanic, you built the entire dungeon around it. You made it tedious by having to play the ocarina to do it instead of just hitting a switch or pulling a lever. And you made it redundant and confusing by having pretty much the entire dungeon look the same. I think the water temple works both to highlight how badly a dungeon is when you design dungeon around a gimmick, but also highlights how well the other dungeons are made, because even the other, what I would call, quote, gimmicky dungeon, the Spirit Temple, is done perfectly. And I'm not using gimmick here negatively, but it's kind of a gimmick to have you complete one half of the dungeon as a kid and the other as an adult. And gimmick tends to have a negative connotation, but in this situation I mean it more in the sense that it's an attention-grabbing ploy. To further illustrate this point, I would like to compare the water temple with the inside of the Deku Tree, the first dungeon in the game. The inside of the Deku Tree is obviously a themed dungeon. It takes place inside of a giant tree, and the environment and enemies match the theme of the dungeon. It wouldn't make much sense, for example, if you were fighting fire slugs here. Spiders, spider webs, parasites, that all matches the theme of the dungeon. The puzzles you solve are related to this theme, that of cleansing the inside of the tree of the parasitic infestation. The gameplay in this dungeon doesn't revolve around one gameplay gimmick though, it's an overarching theme. What I guess I'm getting at is that if raising and lower the water level was one puzzle to get through maybe one or two large chambers, then it wouldn't be such a big deal. It would be one puzzle in a water-themed dungeon. But it's the entire theme of the entire dungeon. And the big problem is that it's not done well. But that's enough of the water temple. I don't like it, you get it. The awesome thing about the dungeon design is that it works so well because of the gameplay mechanics. Being able to go from third to first person to shoot targets, the context sensitive A button, the Z targeting mechanic, they all work to create the framework around which the dungeons are designed. Finally, I want to talk about time travel as a gameplay mechanic. It plays a role in the story section a little bit later, but we'll cover that aspect of it then. For now, I want to mention it from a simply gameplay perspective. I feel like the game could have done without time travel and not lost much from a gameplay perspective. But the addition to it is done sparingly enough that it doesn't become a chore. For example, it's used to solve a few puzzles. Specifically, you can plant magic beans as child Link and then reap the rewards as an adult by reaching previously inaccessible areas. And of course, you use this mechanic when completing the Spirit Temple, which is the only time I can remember that you actually have to time travel to complete the game. Which is why I enjoyed the other time so much. Planting a magic bean to then see the fruits of your labor 7 years later, and then being able to get a reward is kind of nice, since you really have no other reason to go back in time. Now, I've already talked about how much I dislike the Water Temple. I really do. I think it's one of the worst dungeons in 3D Zelda history, but I'm not going to harp on it for too long. I've been effusive with my praise for the game so far, so I guess I have to talk about some things I don't like, so I don't sound like a complete shill. One of my biggest complaints is that certain pieces of heart are hidden behind some minigames that I simply don't like. But it isn't just that I don't like the minigames themselves. I think that hiding a piece of heart behind certain types of minigames is a poor choice. For example, the fishing minigame. I guess there are a lot of people that really enjoyed fishing minigame in Zelda, but I, for the life of me, cannot understand why or how. It's not just tedious and frustrating, it's incredibly boring. It requires no skill, just saintly levels of patience. And 2 pieces of heart are locked behind this minigame. The second one is the archery minigame. The horseback archery minigame isn't terrible, but I just don't like pieces of heart being locked behind this sort of thing. I think the archery minigames should be rewarding you with a larger quiver. and the bomb minigames should be rewarding you with a larger bomb bag, etc. I much prefer the heart pieces to be locked behind challenges of fighting skill or just ingenuity. Can you find a secret? Did you fully explore the world? That sort of thing. Exploration should be rewarded with health. Archery prowess should be rewarded with larger quivers. And this is one of those instances where I completely am fully aware that this is completely my opinion. But like we discussed earlier, reviews are full of opinion. However, I think it just makes more sense for the rewards to match the challenge. Finally, I want to touch on a common complaint that I heard when doing some research for this video. So I did a search for Ocarina of Time is overrated videos, and I watched them. I like to watch videos that are the exact opposite of my sentiments for a variety of reasons, and one of them is just curiosity. Now, as mentioned before, Ocarina of Time is one of the highest rated games of all time, and is still number 1 on Metacritic. It was number 2 on Game Rankings, but sadly that website was shut down and merged with Metacritic. So I was super curious to hear the reasons why people didn't like the highest rated game of all time. Sadly, I was not impressed with the lack of thought or insight or reasons for not liking Ocarina of Time other than too many people like it, so I want to be edgy and cool and say it sucked. Like I said earlier, I can understand if people don't think this is the greatest game of all time, because action-adventure may not be for everyone. For example, I'm not a huge first-person shooter fan, so I'm not particularly fond of Halo. I'm not a big skateboard fan, so I'm not a big fan of Tony Hawk, which is the second highest rated game ever, by the way. Right, but when you say Ocarina of Time is not the best game ever because the graphics suck, and the video was made in 2018, it's kind of a stupid thing to say. There was one complaint, the most common one I heard in all the videos, and that is that Hyrule Field is empty. And that one did get me thinking a little bit. It's true, I even mentioned it in my last playthrough. Aside from Lon Lon Ranch and a few hidden grottos, the only purpose for Hyrule Field is to serve as the hub for the rest of the regions. And I don't think that's inherently a problem. I think the problem is that it's so big. If it were as empty as it is, but say half the size, I don't think it would feel as empty. I think it was supposed to be this epic area that Nintendo wanted us to experience, like, check out this massive world that we've created. And I don't think it failed maybe the first time you play the game. But after that, when you realize there's nothing there, it really does feel kind of empty and kind of pointless. I really have no ideas on how to improve Hyrule Field other than just making it smaller. There's nothing wrong with having a hub area that leads you to the rest of the world. In fact, it makes it rather convenient. But later on in the game, when you have access to songs on the ocarina that can transport you to various places instantaneously, Hyrule Field's hubbiness, that's the official term for it, becomes less important. Again, outside of a few hidden grottos, one of them with a piece of heart, admittedly, and the big pose that you can chase around for the last empty bottle, there's really no point in traveling via horseback through Hyrule Field. There's nothing even cool to look at to make it worth it. Alright, we've spent enough time talking about the gameplay. It's time to give this section its final grade. I'm giving this section 38 points because of the water temple, how some pieces of heart are hidden, and Hyrule Field, but mostly because of the water temple, for which I still harbor a resentment after over 20 years. Anything less than this wouldn't seem right to me because the rest of the game is done so well, and it's just one dungeon. 38 out of 40. Story. The interesting thing about the story in Ocarina of Time is that it has multiple layers, much like an onion. It's easily enjoyable on a surface level because the plot functions perfectly fine as a good versus evil story. But if you dig a little deeper, you can find a little more complexity. Now, Ocarina of Time is an action-adventure game. With older games of this genre, the real call to adventure, as I like to call it, never really had to be that serious. It was usually a rescue mission or some form of revenge quest. Ocarina of Time doesn't really do that. You start off as a kid, but in a strange situation. You see, you're a Kokiri, a child of the forest, but you're lacking a fairy, which all Kokiri have. The game doesn't reveal it to you yet, but of course it turns out the reason you don't have a fairy is because you're not actually a Kokiri. You're a Hylian, but you don't know that yet. A fairy is finally assigned to you by the Great Deku Tree because he knows something you don't. You complete a task for the Great Deku Tree, and it's at this time you are told you need to leave the forest and look for the remaining 2 spiritual stones. Your call to adventure is meeting the princess and finding these 2 stones. It may seem like a strange task for a kid, but again, the Great Deku Tree knows something about you that you don't. He knows you're not a Kokiri. He also knows you're a child of destiny. Eventually, it is revealed to you that you're destined to save Hyrule, but that's not your motivation now, because you don't know this. For now, the task is basically pretty simple. You manage to sneak into the castle, and it's really no surprise later on that Ganondorf takes over, as the security here is really pathetic. When you meet Zelda, she tells you that between the 2 of you, surely you can collect the spiritual stones and talk some sense into her dad, the king. Now, if this sounds like a really stupid idea, it's because it is. You're children, literally little kids playing pretend right now. Mind you, this isn't criticism about the story. This actually makes sense later on. Impa, Zelda's caretaker, tells you that Zelda dreamed about this, so it must be true, and that Zelda has special powers. Okay, fine. I'll buy it for now. Perhaps since Impa is a Sheikah, she also knows something we don't, and maybe she knows Zelda and Link are destined to save the world, so she allows this to continue. Otherwise, if she's just doing it because Zelda dreams about this kind of stuff, then Impa's just being irresponsible. So you're off on your next task, which is to collect the stones. The first one is on Death Mountain in the possession of the Gorons. You do the dungeon thing, and then you head off to collect the final one, which the Zora have. You end up meeting Darunia the Goron and Princess Ruto of the Zora, who both require you to do something for them before they give up the stone. Darunia wants you to prove yourself a man by defeating some monsters, and Ruto actually sort of cons you into a marriage proposal before she hands you her stone. Once you have the stones, the childishness of Zelda's plan really blows up in your face. Ganondorf has taken over the castle. He's apparently killed the king, and his men have killed the guards, and he is after the princess. Presumably, if he gets hold of her, he's going to steal the ocarina and probably dispose of the princess. It doesn't matter because it's at this point where Zelda makes yet another mistake. You see, this entire time, we've been unknowingly and unwittingly helping Ganondorf reach his goal by collecting the spiritual stones. And now she throws you the Ocarina of Time, and with the 3 spiritual stones that Ganondorf himself was looking for, you head over to the Temple of Time and open the Door of Time. Now here's the first big plot twist of the story. You draw the Master Sword, and you unlock the seal to the Sacred Realm, and you let Ganondorf in. And that's it, he wins. Hyrule Castle Town is sacked, the population is either killed or displaced, and I'm not trying to oversell this point here. The game clearly tells you that you've lost. There's a cutscene right before you're awoken by Rauru where Ganondorf laughs maniacally and tells you, "Thank you for letting me in." Let's talk about how unusual this really is for a game. You're presented with what is essentially a fail state in the middle of the story, and it's your fault. Sure, you were just a kid, but that's just it. You had no business making these grand schemes to try to save the world. Now, luckily, Ganondorf didn't achieve total victory. Yes, he got the Triforce, but it turns out it's not just called the Triforce for fun. It's actually 3 pieces. And whenever a person that is not worthy touches it, it breaks off into its 3 distinct parts. The part that is most prevalent in the person who touches it attaches to that person. In this case, Ganondorf coveted power, so he got the Triforce of Power. Courage and Wisdom then went to 2 different people who were most associated with those 2 character traits, Link and Zelda, respectively. And I think this is an interesting bit because the game kind of hints that neither you nor Zelda are actually worthy either. At least that's what I get out of it. If you get the Triforce of Courage, that means that if you had touched it first, would you have broken the Triforce too and only retained the portion of Courage? I get that feeling, but maybe I'm way off. Anyways, you get a chance to redeem yourself by going around and awakening 7 sages, who will help you seal away Ganondorf for good. As you leave the Temple of Time, you notice the world has changed. Hyrule Castletown is the last place you see before you go to sleep, and it's the first place you see post Ganondorf, and it really showcases exactly what losing meant. I think if there's one place that really shows how bad you screwed up, it's Hyrule Castletown. The place is not only deserted, it's been completely destroyed, and there are redeads everywhere. I know I keep harping on this bit, but it's something I really didn't appreciate as a kid that I appreciate more now. But it's not the only place that has changed. Kakariko Village is now overcrowded and the people are struggling. Death Mountain has a weird evil purple cloud surrounding it, and the Gorons have been captured and are going to be fed to a dragon. Zora's Domain is completely frozen over, and the Zoras themselves are encased in ice. Kokiri Forest is overrun by monsters, and the Kokiri themselves are trapped inside their homes. It has all gone pear-shaped. But you get to go to each of these places, and some others that you never went to as a kid, and fix these problems. Not only do you awaken the sages, but you repair the damage Ganondorf's evil has caused. And unfortunately, not all of the results are visible because, like for example, Zora's Domain never unfreezes and you never get to see the Zoras after that. You never get to see the townsfolk return to Hyrule Castletown to repair it. You do get to see the Kokiri come out of their hiding, and you do return Talon and Malon back to their rightful place on Lon Lon Ranch, but a lot of the destruction stays destroyed. It's one thing I wish we had gotten to see more of. Either way, throughout your journey, you keep running into a mysterious young man, Sheik, and he teaches you songs that allow you to warp between different places in the world. This guy is mysterious as heck, and he comes and goes whenever he pleases, and he seems to know some magic, and he can teleport back and forth, and he never really lets you get close. But he knows a lot about the world, and he seems to know a lot about you too. Well, in the second big plot twist of the game, wouldn't you know it, Sheik turns out to be none other than Princess Zelda, who had been in hiding in plain sight all along. Turns out she got the Triforce of Wisdom, and she knew she had to hide from Ganondorf, or else he would come looking for her. She wanted to wait until you woke up the other sages before she revealed herself, because she is a sage too. In fact, she is destined to be the leader of all the sages. Naturally though, as soon as she reveals herself, Ganondorf comes and takes her away, which didn't make much sense to me. If he could take her, why not take you too? It seemed like it would have been easier to trap both of you, unless somehow your courage didn't allow him to. I don't know. That part didn't make much sense to me, to be honest. In any event, it doesn't change anything because you had to go to Ganondorf's castle and defeat him either way, so off you go. The sages make their Skittles Bridge, and you head into the tower. Now, I think one of the main driving points of a good plot is the antagonist, if applicable, of course. So how does this incarnation of Ganondorf stack up in my eyes? I think it's hard to say this is one of the better Ganondorfs in the series, and it seems like a pretty generic evil guy. What's his motive? The Triforce, and he's willing to do anything to get his hands on it. I don't think there's anything necessarily wrong with a bad guy like this, but it's average. I feel like if Link didn't already have a motivation to go on this quest, this would just be a very plain and boring call to adventure. Naturally, in the end, Link, with the help of Zelda's magic, defeats Ganondorf, and the sages seal him away forever. Although the ending strongly implies that you haven't seen the last of Ganondorf, but perhaps you have, and some other hero and princess will have to deal with him. See, for example, the Wind Waker. The ending sequence has Zelda play Zelda's lullaby for you so that you can return to your time and take back the time that was taken from you. And in what is one of the most meaningful moments, at least for me, in the entire game, Navi, your only friend and faithful companion throughout this entire freaking journey, leaves. Nothing tells you this is the end, like the scene of her flying out of the window in the Master Sword Chamber. It was powerful imagery back in 1998 and remains powerful imagery today. But that's not all there is to the story itself. That's not why people have talked about the story in particular for over 20 years. It's the themes that make the story special. This story is about losing the innocence of childhood, of time being a force with which we cannot reckon. And maybe more at its core than anything else, it's a coming-of-age story for Link. Just think about the opening few moments of the game. In the Kokiri Forest, all the children remain children forever. If they leave the forest, they die. Thus, there is eternal childhood here. And think about everything in the build-up to that. You don't have a fairy, everyone else does. You have nightmares all the time. Most of the Kokiri are either indifferent to you, or in the case of Mido, outright hostile. You get your fairy, but immediately you're given a large task, one heavy to bear for anyone, much more so a child. And then you leave the forest, the only place you've ever known, and you're told that if you leave, you die. But you don't die. So you don't belong in the forest? In the place of eternal childhood? Where do you belong? Now, I'm sure there's someone out there somewhere thinking I'm full of crap and I'm reading too much into this. Maybe. On the other hand, these themes pop up all over the game, with Sheik making sure you get the references in case you're not paying attention. Saria, for example, she stays a child after you grow up. The only thing left of your friendship is memories. The flow of time is always cruel, Sheik says. No one can change it. But one thing that doesn't change with time is memory of younger days. With Darunia, time has the opposite effect. Time makes friendships stronger. With Princess Ruto, well, thinking back on her and her personality, her childish attitude isn't the same as childish innocence, but nevertheless, she has grown ambitious and determined. All of these characters share these themes of losing the innocence of childhood, of time being an unstoppable force, and of Link growing up. In the end, Zelda tries to give Link back his childhood, his lost time. But we have realized by this point there's no getting those years back. Even if Link's body is returned to child form, he's not a child anymore. Because despite him being a child again, his memories were not removed, and he's still the adult that he grew to be during this quest. And the insult to injury is Navi flying away. The last vestige of his disappearing childhood, Navi flies away, a symbol that Link will never be a child again. I've heard people say that they don't get why this game is put on a pedestal for its story, because it's generic. And to those people, you didn't get it. And that's not an insult. I didn't get it either, not at first. I'm also not saying that if you don't get it, you're dumb. I'm not saying that at all. Many people won't look further than the basic call to adventure and leave it at that. And there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. But I think if you play the game enough times, you'll catch the subtle subtext. For me, that brings a pretty good story on its surface to a near perfect story with deeper meaning behind it. And I don't mean it's some grand commentary on the human condition or anything pretentious like that. I mean, it's a story of not just adventure and good battling evil. It's a story of the journey of a young Link who becomes a man against his will. But it's not in your face or preachy about it. It's still subtle enough that you can just ignore it. But it's there if you want to look for it. So for me, the story gets a 20 out of 20. Visuals. This section is going to be short. Remember, we're judging this game by 1998 standards. So when I say the graphics are pretty decent, I mean they were pretty decent. To my recollection, Nintendo has never made the most gorgeous games in the industry. Mario Kart 8 was very easy on the eyes, but none of the 3D Zelda games have blown anyone away with the most cutting edge in graphics. Ocarina of Time is no exception. The visual quality is passable, it's average. Where this game really shines, though, is in its presentation and atmosphere. I'm not going to linger too much in this section. Like I said, look, the game isn't going to win any beauty pageants, and it wasn't doing so back in 1998 either. But even today, You have no issue navigating the world. The colors are kind of muddy, but they were like that back in the day too. In the dungeons though, the visual design really shines. There's attention to detail everywhere. The dungeon that really springs to mind for me here is the Forest Temple, with moss and vines hanging from the walls, giving the place a feel of abandonment for many years, while at the same time giving you a feeling that this has always been a place where nature has ruled. Another place where the art style really shines for me is the bottom of the well. Now, I could spend an entire video on the bottom of the well, how creepy it really is, and how seemingly out of place it is in this game, while still being incredibly mysterious. I mean, it's basically a torture dungeon hidden in the bottom of the well in the local village. Blood stains on the floor, manacles, torture crosses, green pools of ooze, and let's not forget the re-deads. It's all incredibly creepy, and it does it not with the highest of visual fidelity, but with the presentation. 12 out of 15. Audio. It's no secret that I think the Legend of Zelda series has some of the best music in the gaming industry, and I think this game is no exception. Just the opening title screen has one of the best tracks, and coupled with the scene of Link riding Epona with a giant full moon setting in the background, it just goes to show that this game is the sum of its parts, the atmosphere that I was talking about in the previous section. The two best themes in the early game for me are the Kokiri Forest theme and the Hyrule Field theme. The dungeons as Child Link are more atmospheric sound than actual themes, with none of the first three dungeons having an actual musical score. Goron Village's theme is silly and reflects the goofy looking Gorons perfectly, but it's not my favorite. Zora's Domain theme likewise reflects the haughty and dignified nature of the Zoras themselves, but again, it's not one I remember with much fondness. They're good, but not great. It's not until the adult dungeons that the dungeons have actual compositions for their themes, and oh boy are they good. Particularly good are the Forest Temple, the Spirit Temple, and the Shadow Temple. I have nothing against the Ice Cave or the Water Temple themes, but they don't stand out to me as much as those three. The Forest Temple theme gives the Forest Temple an incredibly creepy feel, and it's not even the creepy dungeon in the game. Coupled with the visual theme of the dungeon, as well as a lot of the enemies, it really does feel like it could have been more of a haunted ruined castle. The Shadow Temple, of course, is creepy, and it's creepy on purpose. With Bongo Bongo being the boss of the dungeon, and he being basically giant hands beating on a drum, it was appropriate that much of the Shadow Temple theme is percussion. The best far and away dungeon theme, though, has got to be the Spirit Temple. As soon as you walk in, you're greeted with a strong beginning, and then the main theme takes over. It's really well done. Now, the footage you have been seeing is from the Wii U Virtual Console version of the game. And in this version, the Fire Temple theme was changed from its original, objectively superior version, so to me it's the worst theme in the entire game. I'm not going to knock the game points for this, because in the original, the Fire Temple theme was a good theme. The edited theme sounds like it was thrown together in 4 minutes, and it doesn't reflect Koji Kondo, the composer of most of the series' music, or his skill and ability. Finally, let's talk about the Ocarina songs. They're all very simple to play, and the parts that you have to input to play the songs are amazingly all done with the same few notes. You have 5 notes, and you can play all 12 songs with just these notes. The notes are D, B, A, F, and then the A button and up C are actually the same note, D, but an octave higher. I think it's pretty amazing, the variety of songs you can play with just 4 notes. Granted, some of them are very basic, like the Sun Song and Epona Song, but some of them are really good. While I think there are a few duds in the overall musical score, I think for the most part the music in the game is absolutely top-notch. The sound design, I feel, is also a winner. Since you spend so much time with Link, the things that stand out for me the most are the sounds related to him and his movement. For example, you have his footsteps and how the sound changes depending on the surface he's walking on. The sound of his shield clanking against his sword when he moves. Doors opening and closing. And let's not forget the grunting and screaming when he jumps off a ledge or gets hit. The enemies are also pretty good, many of them letting you know they're there before you see them. You can hear the guais cawing before you see them, geese flap their wings, and the Skulltula family also has a very distinct sound, in particular the coveted golden Skulltulas. And let's not forget about the Redeads and Gibdos, whose moans are unmistakable. Now, it would be irresponsible of me to talk about sound design in this game and not talk about Navi. What a controversial figure Navi is. You love her or you hate her, and there's really no in between. For me, as a character, she's super annoying, always interrupting you to tell you how to do the most basic things like walk and open doors. Her iconic, "Hey, listen," is something my dad still to this day says. Her talking doesn't bother me, to be honest. I know it bothers a lot of people, and I 100% understand why, but for me, I prefer her talking than Tattle's little Tinkerbell sound in Majora's Mask. Overall, I'm giving the section a 14 out of 15. Intangibles. I've already mentioned the things that go beyond just the game, that make this game one of the greatest and most important games in history, but it's worth taking a look again. Just right off the bat, this section is getting a perfect 10 out of 10, in case you were wondering. I'll repeat myself from before. If this game isn't your favorite game ever, even if it's not your favorite Zelda ever, even if in fact you think it's wildly overrated, those are all perfectly valid opinions. There's no question that other Zelda games have better dungeons, more interesting weapons, better characters, arguably better music, and better combat. So if you prefer the 2D Zeldas more, or if you just have a soft spot for Wind Waker, or if you just hate fun and like Skyward Sword, that's entirely up to you. But I don't think it's up for debate what this game did for the gaming industry as a whole. First, this game did raise the bar in storytelling for the Zelda series. It introduced a creation story and fleshed out the Triforce lore more than any other game before it. Second, what Z-targeting did for the action-adventure game, in terms of combat, it's not just important, it's genre-defining. You can argue that if it hadn't been Zelda that innovated this mechanic, some other game would have. And that may be true, but it was Ocarina of Time that did it. And every game that has ever used it or will ever use lock-on targeting in a 3D space has this game to thank for the invention. Finally, the context-sensitive action button is probably something we take for granted even more than lock-on targeting. But to be perfectly blunt, gaming would be completely different without it. When the same button or key is used to open doors, pick up items, talk to NPCs, or what have you, think of this game, because this game invented that. Now, of course, the universal use button or key may not be as big of a deal anymore, because controllers have way more buttons now than they did before, but it's still used to this day. The everlasting legacy of this game, from a gameplay perspective, is that games would not be the same if this game had not existed in terms of control. Again, perhaps if not Ocarina of Time, some other game would have invented these control mechanics. But it wasn't some other game. It was this game. And it did both of those things. For that reason alone, this game will always be one of the most important games ever made. And that's what this intangible section is all about. 10 out of 10. Final score, 94 out of 100. The most common complaints that I hear about this game are the graphics suck and the controls are bad. And to be perfectly blunt, those are really stupid complaints to be making 20 years later. Of course the visuals and controls are dated. They're from 2 decades ago. But judging a 1998 game by anything other than 1998 standards, it's just not something I'm willing to do. A much better criticism would be how highly regarded the story is, because truthfully, good story is pretty subjective. I happen to think the story is presented in a very compelling manner. I think the pacing is good. I think there are 2 pretty decent plot twists. I think the fact that you are faced with a losing battle in the middle of the game is a unique take on a story. And while I don't think Ganondorf is a particularly compelling antagonist, I think the call to adventure is. But even if you think the story is just bang average, in my opinion, it's offset by its deeper thematic elements. But it's definitely something that can be overlooked, and maybe to some, having to dig that deep for a story's meaning means the story just isn't good, which honestly is a perfectly valid criticism. For me, it's an added bonus, not a contrivance. But on this particular issue, I'm happy to concede the point if it's just not your jam. Still, the game cannot be undersold for how revolutionary it was. And given its place in the pantheon of gaming, it has to be considered one of the most important games ever made. If you do want to go back and play this game, just be aware that the controls are dated. And please go into this game without preconceptions. The amount of hype surrounding this game means expectations are literally impossible to meet when you play this game for the first time in 2020. That said, if you undertake this journey for the first time ever, if you come with an open mind, you are in for an absolutely epic journey, the likes of which we get very rarely in gaming. Thanks for joining me for this review of The Legend of Zelda: Ocarina of Time. See you next time.